And she didn't even move her lips.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you to Bingham for hosting us so graciously in this wonderful space here today. Thank you to the British American Business Council of New England, particularly to Ken Kovac, the President, and to Ursula Wojciechowski, the Executive Director. You work as a great partner to us. We're very grateful. Welcome to my diplomatic colleagues here today, and to all of you fine representatives of Boston's business community. We're delighted to be here with you. So I'm honoured to welcome Sir Peter Westmacott, my ambassador, here visiting Boston for the 4th time since being ambassador to the United States. Sir Peter has previously served in France, Turkey, Tehran, Brussels, London, and he was the private secretary to the Prince of Wales. It's an honour for us to get him outside of the Beltway and to have him here to address us all today. I'm also pleased to have such an esteemed panel with us this morning. We're going to invite George Donnelly of the Boston Business Journal to introduce them shortly, but we have Congressman William Keating here, who is a great supporter of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and a member of the new House Caucus on the Trade and Investment Partnership, and Marcy Reid, President of National Grid here in New England. I will now invite Sir Peter to come and say a few words. Thank you very much.
Susie, thank you, and thank you to Bingham's for being such wonderful hosts, not for the first time. I think you're great supporters of the British American Business Council. And Congressman Keating, thank you for making the time. He and I know that getting out of the Beltway of Washington is not an enormous hardship. So we're delighted to be on the same panel and warmly welcome him, and particularly given that in addition to being the congressman for Cape Cod, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, all sorts of really hardship places like that, he is also, which is very important in terms of some of the things that we are doing in diplomacy at the moment, the ranking member of the Europe, Eurasia and Emerging Threats Subcommittee of the House Foreign Relations Committee. So particularly appropriate to have him with us, and who knows, our conversation might stray beyond TTIP and prosperity agenda to one or two bits of current affairs on which Congressman Keating, great expert. But we're running a little bit late, so I'm not going to speak for too long. You'll be very pleased to hear, because I think we probably will make better use of your time if we tap into the talent of the panel and make some time to talk about some of the questions that are on your mind. But I'd like just to share with you, if I may, a few thoughts. My mind is still spinning because in the conversations that I was having beforehand, I've been learning about things which I knew almost nothing about, but some of which are very exciting, like methods for ensuring that the water, that filthy stuff that comes out of unconventional exploration of oil and gas from the fracking process, is going to be absolutely squeaky clean and not threaten the water table at all in the future if we follow the advice of one of the businessmen here. I've been learning about how to get, which I shall need probably next week, a personalized knee implant, which will be so much tailored to my personal needs that I shall have instant recovery. The only problem is it's a bit too expensive for the National Health Service in the United Kingdom at the moment, so we'll hope we'll get the bags down. And a wonderful bio and photo-degradable plastic bag, which for those of us who have spent some time, particularly living in developing countries where there is not the same consciousness about waste disposal and plastic bags, and where you see vast areas of a wonderful natural wilderness covered in plastic bags, I think it's hugely exciting that there is here in Boston a company which is going to show the world how to start replacing nasty old plastic bags with something which degrades when it's exposed to sunlight, water, damp, or time. So that's exciting too. So a bunch of other things I've been learning. And yesterday I was beginning to be told about 3D printing with human tissue, which scared me a bit, but that's how I'm going to get a new ear, which is the right shape and size. Synthetic biology, which some of you know all about, and a bunch of other things. So you come to Boston, if you live in the Beltway, to learn about extraordinary areas of technological advance in a whole bunch of different sectors. It might be about mobile applications, it might be financial services, it might be insurance, it might be biosciences. I can see why Susie, my colleague, Consul General, has such a ball in this town and is so stimulated by the amazing company that she keeps. So thank you for having me. It's very exciting. You can see why in my 2 years and 3 months in this job, I've already been to the great city of Boston 4 times, which is more than I think, except for New York, I've been to anywhere else. And I'm thrilled to do it. A couple of thoughts, if I may, before we spread the conversation. I'd like to say a little bit about how the UK is doing and how it feels in terms of our attempt to emerge from the most difficult financial economic crisis we've known since the 1920s, brought upon by the financial meltdown of 2007. And I wanted to say a little word or two about our dear friend TTIP. We used to call it the European Union United States Free Trade Agreement, and thank God the President of the United States, in the State of the Union speech last year, shortened that to TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Still a mouthful if you spell it out, but nice and easy to talk about in shorthand, and we thank him for coming up with a better turn of phrase. And I'll say something about why we think that is very important. But for the UK, we think that we're doing rather better than we were not very long ago. The United Kingdom's economy we've revised our growth estimates for last year about 3 times. We grew at 1.7% in the end, when we thought that we were going to grow at about 0.3%. This year, the UK's economy in 2014 is going to grow at 2.7%. That's the highest in Europe. And when you think that only about 18 months ago we were wringing our hands with concern that we might have been entering a triple-dip recession, we feel quite pleased that that has come out in a much better shape than it might have done. It's been quite painful because, as you probably noticed, there was quite a debate in the UK, or about the UK, amongst some of our partners, that we were cutting too deep in terms of trying to get the deficit under control and not doing enough in terms of stimulus and trying to keep the economy growing. We took the view, British government took the view, that given the fact that we didn't have a reserve currency, given the fact that we weren't protected by the Eurozone, if being part of the Eurozone is protection, but sometimes it is, that we didn't really have a choice but to get our deficit under control. Otherwise, our borrowing costs were going to go through the roof. We got up to almost 12% annual deficit as a result of the collapse of the financial services industry in 2008. We're now down at 5%, and we are still getting that deficit further down. So we've come a long way. It's been pretty brutal. It's meant that we have had a very difficult few years, and there has been quite a lot of criticism of the government of trying to both get the public finances under control in order to keep our borrowing costs down and our debt levels down, and also doing growth. Well, we've seemed to have managed, we're not quite sure how, but we seem to have managed to get both. And so that is, I think, a success story for our government. And so we're continuing along the same path. We need to get the deficit further down. We need to get the accumulated debt reduced. And we need to continue to stimulate the growth. As a result of these policies, as a result of being fiscally responsible, as we would say, it does mean, as George Osborne, my Chancellor of the Exchequer, likes to say, that he has been able to borrow money more cheaply than any Chancellor of the Exchequer for 600 years. And that is one of the results of the disciplined approach we have taken to public finances. We've also done a number of things to try to get the spending under control. I talk a lot with my friends on Capitol Hill about entitlement reform and tax reform and so on. We've gone quite a long way. It's not yet finished, but we have put a cap on benefit payments, partly on the back of 1 or 2 rather horrendous stories where it looked as though there were people accumulating a whole vast array of separate aggregated benefit payments to such an extent that there was no incentive to go and get work. And we're now linking the payment of benefits to a willingness to go and get work if you're fit to do so. We're now looking much more severely at disability payments, which have got to be linked to medical certificates that you are actually unable to work, rather than being signed off once in your life and then that's the end of it. So we're getting payments under control so that we're trying to channel them towards those who really need them, and we're trying to encourage the people who can work to go and get work rather than to feel that it's not worthwhile. It's a cultural change. It's also a very important part of trying to get spending under control. At the same time, we're trying to encourage people to work harder, and we're trying to improve the tax take, if you like, in terms of the taxpayer rather than just the government, which needs to replenish the coffers. In the last budget, there was the Chancellor again raising the threshold at which you begin to pay tax, and again raising modestly the threshold at which the higher rates of tax kick in. And throughout this whole process, and that continues as well in the budget which was announced just a week ago, we are trying to ensure that the United Kingdom remains a business-friendly economy. 4 years ago, corporation tax levels were 28%, still lower than here, still lower than a lot of our competitors in Europe. We're down at 21% now, and we're heading for 20% next time the corporation rate comes down. We've got a whole bunch of different incentives which are in place for R&D development. We've got a patent box, which means that you get extraordinary tax reliefs on inventions which are registered in the United Kingdom by businesses. The Prime Minister announced not very long ago particular tax incentives for companies which want to engage in responsible fracking. We believe we've got a lot of shale gas, maybe some shale oil too, in the United Kingdom. We want to explore that, but we want to explore it responsibly, safely, in ways which don't threaten the water table and which do reassure those who are concerned about the future of the environment. We were doing that in any case before recent political crises in and around Russia and Ukraine made this whole question of European energy dependence on Russia even more of a political issue. But it's an indication of the commitment that we've got to continuing to have the UK as a business-friendly economy. And throughout the process that we have gone through to try to get public finances under control, we have continued to develop the infrastructure of the country. We put money into a number of industrial sectors to try to ensure that we are not as dependent on financial services, both for tax income and for employment, as we had been up until 2007. We attach enormous importance to having a properly regulated, thriving, globally superior financial services industry, but we also need to ensure that we've got other things that we do, other parts of the country, as well as the southeast of England, where there is employment. And so we're developing our skills, and we're providing the incentives for business to get more involved in the sectors where we have got strengths, more in life sciences, more in aerospace, more in automobile, a sector which has come back from the dead more or less 30 years ago, so that now our exports are growing at 30% a year. 80% of every vehicle built in the United Kingdom goes to an export market, and many of them coming, I'm delighted to say, to this country. So we're buzzing along. It's still fragile in a number of respects. Our export performance, not as strong as we would like. And paradoxically, even though one of the successes is that the unemployment rate has not gone through the roof, and we're still we have come below 7% in terms of unemployment. The fact that the unemployment level has remained pretty respectable at a time when we had very little growth has raised questions about competitiveness, about productivity. We're going to have to look at that. Some of it may be because people have simply accepted to work shorter hours and do less of a job rather than have become less productive. But the economy itself is asking itself some questions about that, which we are very keen to address. But overall, we feel that over the last few years, we've come through a very tough period, that we're looking in better shape. There's still a long way to go, and we still have got a lot of money that we're going to spend on improving the infrastructure of the UK. But we still remain the #1 in Europe in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, much of it coming from the United States, I'm delighted to say. And we still pride ourselves on the United Kingdom being the destination of choice for foreign investors, especially those with whom we have the privilege of sharing a common language. In other words, many of our friends from here. So that's all going well. One of the things that we have been promoting as part of our attempt to get the global economy on a path for sustained recovery is more free trade. And this is one reason why David Cameron, my Prime Minister, when he was here a couple of years ago, was pushing very hard with the President of the United States the idea of this free trade agreement, the thing that we now know and love as TTIP. It took a little while for everyone to decide whether they wanted to go ahead with this. This is not something the British government is responsible for negotiating, because external trade for the European Union member states of 28 countries is something which is managed by the European Commission. But the European Commission is not going to do that unless the member states want it to happen. So we've been amongst the countries in the vanguard of pushing for more free trade. And as a result of all that pressure, and as a result of very good work done here by USTR, White House, and many others, it is just over a year since the President announced that the United States was determined to try to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union to match the one that is currently being negotiated already, the TTP with the Pacific Rim countries. These negotiations are going on in parallel. The Trans-Pacific one, of course, has been going for rather longer, and it's had a number of additional rounds of negotiations compared to the European-US TTIP thing, which is only about round 4, round 5 now. But nevertheless, we are making progress. We're getting into some of the difficult issues, not just tariffs, but a whole bunch of other issues of regulatory standards, mutual recognition of qualifications, healthcare issues, phytosanitary issues in the agricultural trade, a whole bunch of areas that are going to be difficult. But that's a sign that the negotiations are getting into real business. But we think that this is a very important way of trying to ensure that the global economy gets out of that recession. European Union, North America, half the world's GDP between us, almost half the world's international trade. If we can make this thing happen, our economists tell us that we're looking at something like 2% additional GDP on either side of the Atlantic, if it can be a genuinely comprehensive agreement. It's not going to be easy, but we are very keen, we on the European side, to ensure that there are no exclusions from the beginning. Of course, there's going to be give and take, and I'll give you a bit of this, you give me a bit of that in the final rounds of those negotiations. But if you start out a comprehensive trade agreement with certain areas which are just cut out because it's too difficult, then you're not going to get very far. So we've been very keen on this thing being comprehensive. And one of the areas where we're at the moment having some robust conversations with our friends in Washington in the US Treasury is whether or not financial services regulation should be included in these negotiations. There are a number of different fora within which there are negotiations between Europeans and Americans, between New York and London, between our two governments, which are going ahead. But there's an awful long way to go. Here in America, on the back of the shock of the Lehman Brothers collapse and all the things that flow from that and the global financial meltdown, you've got Dodd-Frank, which has been largely implemented. Massive piece of legislation. People don't want to undermine that. We understand it. We've got something called the Vickers Report, which was a report which we commissioned to look into the question of trying to ensure that in the future we did not have banks that were too big to fail and that we weren't in the business, which is politically so toxic, of taxpayers feeling that they were in the business of paying for losses of bankers while the bankers took the profits when they were successful. You've got to look at that in a way which is politically equitable and acceptable. We've made some progress. Here in the United States, a lot of progress has been made. But what we don't want is to have a completely divergent set of regulations, which means that we can't do business together, which means that banks and other financial services organizations have to have a completely duplicatory set of regulations and financial requirements and capital left in the bank, which are unnecessary because you're doing them separately for each jurisdiction, rather than having a degree of mutual recognition of standards and of regulatory frameworks. That's what we hope we will get. That, I believe, is what the industry here would like, certainly what City of London would like. It's not about a race to the bottom of the lowest standards that apply in some parts of the European Union, where we know there have been problems. It is about trying to ensure that we all have a much better regulated financial services sector. Just an example of one of the areas where we are still in active debate. But the really encouraging thing, I think, for us is that there is such a very strong sense of commitment within the administration, within the Chamber of Commerce, within much of organized labor. And we find also a lot of bipartisan support within Congress for more free trade between the European Union and the United States. We haven't got fast-track authority yet. That's not likely to happen this side of the midterm elections. The congressman can comment on that if people want to ask, I'm sure. But I am reassured by the fact that the administration of this country has never actually failed to obtain fast-track authority when it has applied for it. It doesn't always come the week after you put in the bid. It can take waiting for elections like midterms to be out of the way before you do these things. But in the end, it comes right, and it has in the past, and we don't believe that the fact that we're not going to have fast-track authority just yet means that there is any reason to slow down in terms of those negotiations. I dwell on all that because I think it is a very important part of what we are doing as a UK government network across America, making the case for TTIP. We believe, for example, that in New England, one would see 25% increase in exports to the European Union from this entire region if we had a comprehensive free trade agreement. That's worth having, given that there are existing very high levels of trade and investment. Let's do much better. And so we are making the case for that across the country. But the economic analysis that we have made suggests that this would be enormously significant in terms of boosting exports from pretty well every single state in the Union if we could make this thing work. So that is that. Allow me to finish just by saying, in terms of not so much European Union, but bilaterally, how proud we are of the very strong business links that exist between us and this part of the world. There are many countries, many companies from this region which are present in the United Kingdom with big presences already established. There are a number of you who are thinking of going to the UK. I've talked to a number of you businessmen who are either about to start or have just opened offices in the UK. We're thrilled about that. Encouraging foreign investment to the United Kingdom is one of the big reasons that we are here. We do a certain amount of foreign policy and all that kind of stuff as well. But the prosperity agenda, trying to do more to create sustainable recovery from the crisis, more prosperity, more jobs, more wealth, is really the biggest single reason why we're here. We're delighted that Bingham's, for example, have got a big office in the UK where you have been for 40 years. Congratulations on that anniversary. Fidelity Investments, another example, been in the UK for 20 years, employing 2,500 people and managing a modest £30 billion worth of assets. Staples are there in the retail sector, 130 stores in the UK. We have got a big GE presence, Raytheon, who I've worked with very closely over the years in terms of trying to promote exports from factories of Raytheon in the UK to third country markets. Very big presence there. And in the other direction, we've got British Aerospace, BAE Systems, who are here in Massachusetts. We've got a bunch of other UK firms who are here. Citizens Bank, of course, which is part of the RBS family, Cambridge Consultants, and a whole bunch of others that I could mention. All just an example of the depth and breadth of the business relationship that unites us. Thank you for the welcome that those British companies are made, and thank you for the interest that all of you are paying to transatlantic trade in general, but to the business and political and social and cultural and all the other links which we've got between this part of the United States and the UK. Not least, here's my final word, and then we'll go and talk some really interesting things with the panel, the way in which the high-tech, high-end businesses and world-class universities between our two countries, so many of which in America are in this part of the country, cooperate together. Britain and America have the 10 best universities in the world, whatever rating you want to look at. We have 18 of the top 20 universities in the world. They are working more and more closely together, and thank God our businesses are finding more and more effective ways of tapping into the extraordinary brilliance of MIT and Cambridge and Harvard and different parts of the universities to ensure that business capital is harnessed to the brilliance of the universities, the academic institutions, to ensure that we remain one step ahead of the competition, that we retain those cutting edges, and that customers the worldwide and societies the worldwide have got access to ever-improved technology to make this world a better, safer, and more prosperous place. And I think what goes on here between the northeast of the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union more generally, is an absolutely critical part of that. And I congratulate you for the role in which you all play in that. So thank you for giving me a hearing. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your interest in US-UK business. And I think with that, we should go and have a panel discussion.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Westmacott. You can hear me okay. I'm George Donnelly of the Boston Business Journal, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be on the panel. My job is basically to keep order for the rest of the time, and somehow I don't think that's going to be a big problem here. I think people seem well ordered already. TTIP doesn't necessarily come off the tip of your tongue. It reminds me of a cover story we did at the BBJ a few months ago, subtly titled "The European Invasion," in which we outlined a pretty major trend of startups from the Eurozone coming over to Boston in various stages here to access the capital, the talent, and the market opportunities in Boston. So it's probably fair to say that there's no region in the U.S. that has more to gain than Boston from a trade agreement with the EU. And I'm fond of saying that Boston is already a net winner from globalization because globalization rewards innovation and high concentrations of intellectual capital. And when it comes to the life sciences and the concentration of higher ed institutions, among other areas, Boston is second to none, and it's certainly the best East Coast option for startups. So obviously, cementing the largest bilateral trade deal in the world would be a tremendous boon here at home. So it's my pleasure to be on the stage with Congressman Bill Keating of the 9th District. As Susie has mentioned, is very much involved in the international trade scene in D.C., and Marcy Reed, president of National Grid. Marcy, by the way, just told me that we have just experienced the coldest winter on record in Boston So it makes you wonder why these startups are coming over here. So first we'll hear from Congressman Keating. Please welcome Congressman Bill Keating.
Do it here.
Anywhere you want. Yeah.
Just for the people in the back of the room, I'll stand up a little bit. First of all, I want to thank our hosts, Stephen Brown and Bingham, for doing this. This is very important. In the words of our Vice President, which I won't quote word for word, this TTIP agreement is a big deal. And it's great to be here with Ambassador Westmacott and Consul General Kitchens, joining partnership with which our U.S. President and their Prime Minister will acknowledge is a partnership that will include the two strongest allies. And so it's an important partnership in that respect alone. I've had the occasion to see some of you and talk to some of you as I'm recalling some of my past experience when I was taxation chairman, when they called it taxation here in Massachusetts. And for everyone's relief, I haven't run into someone that I dealt with directly when I was a district attorney for several years. So be at ease in the crowd. The TTIP agreement is an important one. And why is it such a big deal? It's a big deal on many fronts. Just 2 days ago in Brussels, with the summit between the European Union and the U.S., obviously right now Ukraine is in the top of the issue, but the second issue, which was really meant to be the first before this happened, is TTIP, the free trade agreement that exists. And the reasons why it's so important are really many layers, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to go through them so we get an idea. First of all, the magnitude of it. There's $4 trillion of direct investment existing now with the European Union and the United States. And the amount of two-way trade annually is approximately $1 trillion. Now, when you look at this worldwide, that's already about half the entire world's GDP. This agreement would push it even further. And what are the benefits of doing that? Number one, the threefold. It deals with market access, and the best thing to think about with that is tariffs. It deals with regulation, and you look at all the standards that occur there in the automobile industry and so many other industries where we have to really harmonize those structures in regulation. To show you how important regulation is, if we only deal with 10% of the 96+ billion dollars we have that are tied up in regulation in excess costs, that equals the whole effect of the tariff reduction at 100%. So that second part of it is very important. And the third stool of that, the third pillar of that is rules. And that'll deal with issues like labor standards and environmental standards. It's important to see the benefits of this even beyond the economic side. Number one, there's no area of the world where there's greater shared values than there is with the European Union and the United States of America. And when it comes to having that kind of economic clout, we can deal with the important issues. We can deal more effectively with the theft of intellectual property, having sanctions surrounding that for those countries that don't abide by the rules. We can have a great clout in terms of the environmental impact, which we've seen as so much of a world problem right now, and we seem unable to cope with it. And we can deal with shared values in terms of security, which will take me right back to Ukraine and what's going on. When he was being questioned for his position as the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey was asked, what is the most important security issue for the United States of America? His answer was, our economy. And we're seeing that play out in Europe right now, and we're seeing it with Ukraine. Because there are limits on what we can do militarily, although we're trying to reshape NATO. There are limits that can be done. The strength of our security will surround our economic strength. And if you put the European Union and their values together with the United States, we're going to have the strongest voice for rule of law, the strongest voice for human rights issues and the way people are treated, And when people act in an aggressive way that Russia is right now, breaking the laws, we'll have even a greater opportunity to impose economic sanctions which will deter them more than anything else. This is an important agreement. Now, Massachusetts is benefited disproportionately. And just look at the increase that the Bertelsmann Foundation projections are for Massachusetts. Over a 28% increase in exports out of Massachusetts. And in New England, they're saying a minimum of 38,000 new jobs. Half of those jobs are Massachusetts jobs. So we have a lot at stake. We have a lot to benefit. And the interesting thing that I found as I've met more European leaders coming in to have discussions is the feeling they have about Boston and about our region. To a person, they'll say that, and New York might disagree with this, but to a person, their view is that Boston is the most comfortable city, the most European city, the city that they feel more welcome to stay in, live in, while they're here and do business in. So there's a lot at stake for our area in particular, and I really appreciate raising the level of this because there will be bipartisan support, which is no small thing in Congress right now. There will be bipartisan support for this. And I have agreed with many free trade unions that have been formed in the past. I always had a bit of skepticism. In this one, I am highly optimistic. We have the engagement of all the leaders in these countries investing in this. We have so much at stake and so much to benefit. And if we don't succeed, there'll be a vacuum that exists economically where these security issues and these environmental issues and these issues of overall strength of companies will be filled. And they're going to be filled by emerging countries that do not have the same shared values that I mentioned that we have together. So thank you for highlighting this, and I'll be glad to take any questions along with our panel.
Thank you, Congressman. Please welcome Marcy Reed, President of National Grid.
So to buck the trend, I'm going to sit in my chair, assuming the lady in the green in the back can hear what I'm saying. She can't hear what I'm saying. Do I need to stand up at the podium? Oh, okay. All right, so much for that. Sorry.
You're not wired. Have you switched it on?
I'm wired.
Did you switch it on?
I have switched it on. I don't know. I don't speak loud enough. That's not something I normally hear. Anyway, thanks an awful lot for having me on the panel, Ambassador. It's wonderful to have you in our community. I absolutely meant this morning to bring you a Red Sox pin, and I forgot. So come back, and I will give you a pin. And Congressman Keating, good to have you up here, obviously, as always. Susie and Steve, thanks for having us. So my perspective on this topic is really about, obviously, energy. National Grid is a large UK-US company. The term National Grid, by the way, describes what we are in the UK, and we carry the name here to the northeast of the US. And so when I hear the Ambassador and the Congressman speak about TTIP and economic growth and trade and booming economies, I think none of that happens if we don't have a strong energy infrastructure underpinning all of that. And so you would be interested to know that we're doing a lot of work modernizing our energy infrastructure, both on the electricity and on the gas side. In fact, we will be spending in the neighborhood of 35 billion with a B pounds, or around $56 billion on our infrastructure in the next 8 years. And that's because folks are evolving their expectations, whether you're a homeowner and have multiple devices you want to plug in, or you want to connect to gas, or you're a business. And you're increasingly looking at smarter technologies and higher quality power. We have to do a lot to our infrastructure to accommodate those evolving expectations. Also, with the entire clean energy future that both the UK and the US, and thankfully many other countries are pursuing, that also calls for us to make significant changes in our infrastructure in order to connect and be part of the clean energy future. So on the electric side, modernizing the grid, bringing smart technologies, even just giving consumers better data I think, who goes to the grocery store for an entire month, buys everything that they want, doesn't ever check out, but then 15 days at the end of the month gets a bill in the mail. That's kind of how we bill you right now, and all of that needs to change. On the gas side, upgrading our gas infrastructure to accommodate the whether they are aging infrastructure, decades-old pipe, introducing more technology to our infrastructure, or to simply accommodate that growth that I mentioned. These are all of the reasons why we need to continue to invest these 35 billion pounds. And so at National Grid, we have really, I will say quite proudly actually, that we consider ourselves in the energy industry one of the thought leaders in the country here, as well as in Britain. And we've pulled together a strategy piece that we call Connect 21. And in a nutshell, it's about bringing our 20th century infrastructure into the 21st century. Most of you would agree we're not there today. And it has everything to do with turning the regulatory paradigm around. So, Congressman, I was excited to hear your second point around regulation. We need to absolutely change our regulatory framework so that we can accommodate what you, our customers, deserve and expect from us. Secondly, it's putting the customer in charge of the energy that you use, and sort of changing that metaphor I used earlier around the grocery bill. And then also, very importantly, enabling innovation and technology that is out there. Maybe, George, the reason that so many companies are coming to very cold Massachusetts, which, in a few short months will be 100 degrees, by the way, let me remind you.
Thank you for reminding me.
Is because of the many technologies that are coming to market, and as a sort of staid, boring, traditional, regulated industry, we need to find a way to let all that in, and we embrace that. So happy to have those partnerships. So just to really wrap up, when I think about energy and what it means to the global economy, it really is an economic driver. It creates jobs. It underpins the growth that so many of you and we are trying to create, in addition to being the right thing to do from an environmental perspective. So happy to take questions when we get to the panel.
Well, we have a microphone in the middle of the room, and would love to hear your questions. I just want to get the conversation going with kind of basically one basic political question about the lay of the land. This sounds so compelling, so important, so vital. What are the sticking points? Why aren't we further down the road at this point? I'd like to ask you, Congressman.
Well, we've had 4 meetings already on this on both sides of the Atlantic. We're scheduled to have 4 more meetings moving the ball forward this year alone. And I think it's moving. We have some things we have to look at very carefully. Right about this time of year, the elections are occurring through Europe, and as the ambassador mentioned, they could have an impact. And during those elections, some of these issues, which will have more national basis, for instance, in France, agricultural issues are a real sticking point, and they've tried to move that to exclude it at the front end. But as the ambassador mentioned, we push very hard to keep every area open as we move forward. So those elections will have a factor. And here at home, there'll be elections coming up in the fall. In the U.S., people aren't focused on this issue. I think with some of our reporting, they like to show people squabbling more than dealing with some issues like this. But the reality is, this is a huge jobs bill, as well as a huge security bill, and we really have to do things as we're doing this morning to raise the level of that, and that will help. The thing I think politically that we have in place right now, the investment of our national leaders to drive this forward. That wasn't the case as at other times. So this is an important time to make sure that we are successful in this.
Ambassador Westmacott, any sense about the core sticking points?
I think what Congressman Keating says is exactly right. It's very good that we have got a pretty high level of bipartisan support for this in pretty well all the European countries as well. There are sticking points. There are certain interest groups which are nervous about breaking down barriers. Where are we stuck at the moment? I wouldn't say we were stuck anywhere, But the fact that we're now getting into the serious negotiation, I think, means we're making progress. On tariffs, frankly, there isn't a huge amount still to be done. We think that the opening offer on tariffs on the United States side could have been a bit more generous, but it'll move. That's what always happens in negotiations. On the United States side, there is disappointment that we haven't been more forthcoming on some of the agricultural trade potential for pork and for beef and for poultry. And so on.
Cheese is an issue also.
Cheese, especially soft cheeses, can be an issue. But there are other areas where there are some pretty easy wins. You know, it's pretty daft that automobile manufacturers, for example, have to add 5-10% to the cost of the vehicle that you buy in America, you buy in Europe, the same car, because of different regulatory things, different colored indicator lights on the back of the car or different location of the airbag. You know, this sort of stuff, it really ought to be possible to drive down costs by having the same standards. Standards, regulation, where we can simplify and harmonize is probably the most effective way of getting down the cost and giving consumers a better deal. Then there's the issue of the regulatory framework for certain industries that I touched on just now with financial services. That's going to require quite a bit of work because we have to reassure people that proper regulation is in place and that we're not setting ourselves up for all sorts of further dramas in the future. But I think at the moment, I think it would not be right to say that there are, if you like, major sticking points. I think the encouraging thing is that we're now getting into serious negotiation on all these areas where both sides are going to have to make movement.
I just recently read that there's some pushback, speaking of pushback, from Democratic leadership on the fast track. Is that your assessment? Do you think is that going to drop?
Well, Harry Reid recently came out with a statement that he wasn't optimistic, and there's a feeling, frankly, a little bit of uncertainty on both sides to hand that much power over administratively. There always has been, because just in a nutshell, that approach would allow the administration to go ahead, make their package, and Congress would have an up or down vote. Now, we have parts of the country and many members of Congress that represent agricultural areas here and have other areas, and they are reticent right now to give that much authority and then be forced to have only an up and down vote. So it's the collective process. And interestingly enough, we're going to face those same challenges on the other side of the Atlantic as well, especially in some food areas, but we're going to have those kind of changes. The good thing is, an encouraging thing, the automobile industry is just going ahead already, and they're working together to synchronize different standards. So one thing that is important to note now, some of the industries themselves can start working to prepare for this and get a head start. So that, in a sense, will be an informal kind of fast track.
Interesting.
Two quick comments on that. I mean, it's worth remembering, still on the automobile industry, the biggest exporter of automobiles from the United States of America is a European manufacturer. So if we can get to the point where European vehicles and the United States vehicles are, by and large, the same product for the different markets, we're going to drive down costs, we're going to improve job prospects and export potential from this country as well as in both directions. It really is win-win stuff. On the Fast Track Authority, I touched on that a moment ago. Harry Reid has made his views clear. I think it'll come back onto the agenda later in the year. I hope that it will. But I think we need to remember also that this is partly about concern, the Congressman will correct me if I'm wrong, about the other trade negotiation, because the Fast Track Authority would be given both for our beloved TTIP, but also for the Trans-Pacific negotiations, for the negotiations between the United States and the Pacific Rim countries. Those negotiations are a bit further advanced, but they're also negotiations which in some cases cause more concern than the European ones. But the Fast Track Authority would be a single authority for both, and that's probably one of the reasons why it's becoming a little bit difficult for Congress to summon up its courage and say, okay, we'll give the administration that authority.
Yeah, and I think that was a great point, because when I was in Munich just a few weeks ago, we met with the CEOs in Germany in a major luncheon, and they heard Senator Reid's statement and viewed it singularly through the lens of just TTIP. And I mentioned at the time, I said, there's a whole level of support that's different between the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement and TTIP. And it harkens back on those values that I talked about. Labor issues, much more synchronized across the, and making sure there's a quality of product standard, which is, again, a shared value we have. So we should look at, that's a great point, we should look at both of them differently, even though they're lumped together now.
Congressman, if I could jump onto that point, from a business perspective, when you talk about labor, one of the challenges that we face is the skills gap right now. So all this growth that we're talking about, we actually can't hire engineers fast enough. We can't hire line workers and gas mechanics fast enough, and it's all about in the background, the big machine around skilling the future workforce, potentially working with the colleges and schools to build that workforce for the future. So that also needs to happen, and I'm hoping is in the background of all these discussions.
Right, and Marcy, that's a terrific point to make, because we're looking at standards, we're looking at tariffs, people look at the difference in corporate tax. One of the greatest economic experts right now in Europe is their ambassador, Ambassador Amon, and he told me that in his view, there are $1.6 trillion of investments just waiting on the sidelines right now to go into the U.S. And he said the biggest reason that's not happening is because we don't have a trained, skilled workforce for those jobs. So we're hearing it from our domestic companies. We're hearing it from other countries who want to invest here. And this is the United States of America. This is something we should be able to change in just a few years. And if you walk away from anything that's critical and it's just not in the center of TTIP, it's just what Marcy said, that we have to do a better job educating these skilled workers.
This has been a rowdy crowd.
Calm down.
The ambassador's time is limited. I'm sure there are questions out there. Sir, do you want to step up so we can everyone can hear you if you can get there?
My question, I want to go back to the energy policy question and the issue with Russia, which obviously has a lot of leverage over Europe because of its energy resources. Has their moves caused us to rethink things like Keystone Pipeline and within Europe developing their own internal resources to become less dependent upon Russia?
You want to take it first?
I could just deal with the political side of it. That's a real issue, and Russia is doing that. In Hungary, for instance, they've just invested with the government of Hungary, Russia, a 60-year agreement, trillions of dollars in their energy. And they're doing this, they're using energy as a political and security tool. And in Moldova right now, where they moved ahead on trying to become a member of the European Union, they're being threatened right now by Russia for higher energy costs, and Georgia is facing the same things. Now, natural gas, which the ambassador talked about, is a huge issue, and more than the Keystone, it's natural gas and their own pipelines and perhaps some support from the U.S. That they're looking at in terms of balancing off those Russian pressures.
I would say the answer to your question is yes. What's going on in Ukraine, Russian behavior, is definitely making the Europeans look again at their sources of supply for energy. There is too high a level of dependence on Russia for oil and gas. It varies a lot between countries. Some are up in the 70-80%. Germany's in the sort of 30-35%. We actually, by chance, in the UK, buy only 1% of our gas from Russia, but it might be more. Overall, European levels of dependence on Russian oil and gas are too high, and I think we know from history, when we think back to the moment when the Berlin Wall came down, the price of crude was $20 a barrel. It was partly because Russia was not able to sustain the cost of managing an empire which was beginning to fall apart and where there was a lot of discontent. Russia, at the moment, half its state revenues come from the oil and gas sector. 60% of Russian exports are from oil and gas. They do need to understand that if they're not going to play by the international rules, if they're going to help themselves to somebody else's territory illegally in every respect and by the terms of every treaty that any of us have ever looked at, that there are going to be consequences. And so already the European Council just a few days ago instructed the European Commission to look at ways in which we can improve the interconnectedness of European energy markets, look at diversification of sources of supply. There are already things that people are beginning to do. And I think one of the signals that we would love to see was that the whole possibility of exporting natural gas from the United States as a result of the shale gas revolution is something which is going to be perhaps accelerated. Just the other day, I noticed that the 7th permission, in principle anyway, from the Department of Energy was given for the export of natural gas from Oregon. I think that's a great start. It's expensive. It costs around, when I last looked at the numbers, 12 times more expensive per heating unit to transport gas internationally than to transport oil. So you've got to invest in LNG terminals, you've got to invest in specialized boats, you've got to invest in terminals to receive the gas as well as to export it. This takes time, it takes money. The numbers have got to add up. But nevertheless, the mere fact that the United States is already importing so much less oil and gas than it was even 5 years ago as a result of unconventional exploration of oil and gas here, and as a result of a number of economy measures, that's already a hugely important signal to the global market. But there will be further changes because we have to change the existing levels of dependence.
I would simply say on the U.S. front, I could only dream about federal energy policy. And I do dream about it because I'm weird. But it also brings up the whole topic of renewables. And though gas will always be in our mix, so will coal, by the way. They'll always be in our mix. We are more and more dependent on wind and solar. In the UK, we have 9,000 connected megawatts, which I know means nothing to you, but to put it in perspective, it makes Cape Wind look like a pinwheel on your front yard. 9,000 connected megawatts offshore in the UK. And so the whole industry is changing, and it's a fantastic point that you brought up.
More questions? Sir.
Thank you. I actually have two questions that are quite disparate. First, when we're looking at the situation happening in the Ukraine and Russia, Russia supplies a great deal of titanium. I work in regenerative medicine. Over 95% of the world's titanium comes from Russia. We're starting to see already increased prices on titanium and titanium rods and nitinol, which are used not only in regenerative medicine but also cardiology. I want to know how we can address this issue on titanium from Russia, the world's dependence upon Russia for titanium, how that's going to impact businesses in the United Kingdom and in the States, especially looking at regenerative medicine. So whether you're looking at a new hip or a new knee, or looking at spinal fusion, these things are all dependent upon access to titanium and nitinol. Secondly is I see how TTIP benefits large companies. But when we look at Massachusetts, Forbes scored Massachusetts as a D on a grading scale for startup companies. I'm curious how we can advance or improve Massachusetts startup company rating to encourage some of that TTIP business in startups rather than in just large industry.
I was afraid he'd ask the titanium question. Anyone want to take the?
Titanium, it's an absolutely key point. We're very aware of the fact that the world is very largely dependent on titanium, which comes from Russia. Whether there are alternatives which can be developed, I do not know. All I can say is that certainly my government and other European governments do realize that. Russia is very important for rare earths, for titanium. There are a number of ways in which we are economically very integrated with Russia. There are going to be some difficulties if we're going to do less business in the future. One of the things that we have decided upon so far is on a calibrated range of responses. There are a number of further steps that could be taken if President Putin decides that he wants to do yet more activity of the sort that he's done so far. We've kept some in reserve. We are not at the moment looking to break all economic, commercial and other links, political, foreign policy and so on. What we have tried to do is to convey a very clear message that what's been done in Ukraine is unacceptable, in Crimea in particular, but also to indicate that there are other things that can be done in the future if they have to be done. Titanium is an area in which it would obviously be very difficult if suddenly the world was no longer available to access those supplies. We hope very much that President Putin will actually respond to the messages that we have given, to grasp that what he's done is not right, not to go further, and to realize that it would be much better to take some of the off-ramps which the President of the United States and the European Union collectively have been offering systematically since the beginning of this crisis. We do not wish to have all connection, all trade, all cooperation stopped. but we have to make clear that we can't go on like this. So titanium is indeed an area where we're going to have to think about it very carefully. But the point I would make is that we hope it's not going to come to that. We hope that President Putin is going to start realizing this is not in Russia's interest or anybody else's interest to go further down this track.
And it's a great question to bring forth another point. This is an incredibly stupid policy, to be as blunt as I can, that Russia's undertaking. Because there will be, as we move to sanctions, there will be some disruptions, there will be some escalations in price. We'll feel it. In Europe, they're going to feel it a little bit more. Countries like Germany, that are tremendous trading partners with Russia, will feel that. But if they continue on this course, no country will suffer more than Russia itself. They will become increasingly isolated. The energy, if they start using hostage tactics on depriving countries of energy or escalating and spiking the prices, they will find, it might take a couple of years, alternatives, and then they'll be out of that market. So they cannot continue to isolate themselves. Indeed, in conversations I had over the last couple of years with Russian officials, we'd be talking about one or two other issues. And invariably, in the early parts of the conversation, they would bring up TTIP. And they'd do it dismissively, saying, oh, that's never going to happen, is it? They have a great fear of the European Union working together with the United States becoming such a power. They're threatened by that. And most economists will tell you, however, they can benefit by that if they don't isolate themselves. Yet, that's what they're doing with this Cold War mentality that might be winning points with Putin at home right now. But over a period, even a short period of time, they're going to find out they will be hurt the most.
You asked a question about startups, too, but maybe we can talk after. Is it time to get moving?
Yeah, startups, quickly. The analysis that's being done will benefit startups as well. So they're going to be benefited equally in this effort.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the British American Business Council of New England's Board of Directors, it's my privilege to thank the panel for what they did. Ambassador Westacott, I really appreciate your remarks about tax. As a tax lawyer, the tax changes that have gone on in the UK. I wish the United States had the foresight and the ability to be able to make some of those changes. President Reed and Congressman Keating, thank you for your comments. As a former school teacher, I understand the ability of trying to teach and trying to get people trained to do what we need to do. And our moderator this morning, Mr. Donnelly, you did a very good job. Thank you. And on behalf of the BABCNE, I would like to thank our hosts. Back in 1986, BABCNE started when David Burns, our consul, under the impetus of a fellow by the name of Prince Charles, said that we should have a British-American group here in the Boston area. And 10 companies were brought together at that time to put that together. And Bingham was one of the leaders then. And today, from 1986 to today, Bingham has been one of our big supporters. So thank you very much for what you've done for us. And it enhances the trade between the United States and the UK. We have a group of consuls here this morning. Thank you for being here. Got here early, and it's always good to have our consuls. And most importantly, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. You're our lifeblood. You're the reasons that we do this. And I think you've noticed today from the discussion we had, the high-level discussion, of what a value BABCNE can be to you and your business. If you're doing international trade with the UK, if you're thinking of doing it, if you'd like to do it, this is the place you have to be. This is where we discuss international trade. This is where the international trade works. And our strong relationship with the consul's office and with UKTI, we have been very successful in putting on programs like this and others. And I hope to see you at many of those programs. And thank you, Susie, and thank you, Ursula, for all the work that you've done to put this together. And everybody, have a good day. Thank you. Thank you very much.